Thank you for watching Blue Earth County's Election Judge Training Course recap videos. These videos are indicated to be a review and refresher of the material covered in our in-person election judge training classes. Please note that watching these videos are not an alternative to the in-person training, which is a requirement to serve as an election judge in Blue Earth County. If you wish to be an election judge and you have not attended an in-person training, please contact the election judge or the election office for more information. We'll also point out that our election judge training is divided into 3 sections, and you are watching the middle video, the video about election day activities. If you wish to watch more information about our election judge training series, please watch the first video, which prepares our election judges for polling place service, as well as getting the polling places ready for election day voting. Or our third video, which will focus on closing the election day activities, reconciling the results, returning them to the county's office, as well as security information for our polling places. When we talk about election day considerations, we want to always have our election judges thinking about who should be accessing a polling place, as well as who is allowed in a polling place throughout election day. Polling place access is restricted to election judges who are appointed to serve in that location, as well as people actively engaged in the voting process. This is, of course, including folks that are voting, as well as folks providing assistance to that voter, provided they've been asked to be there by the voter, as well as vouchers or children who may be accompanying the voter. There are also additional authorized persons who may be in the polling place. However, these folks need prior authorization or credentialing in on election day. Please note that Minnesota does not have poll watchers or poll observers or other similar titles in the polling place that have not been pre-authorized by the county or the state of Minnesota. If we become aware of any observers who will be in the polling place, we will make sure the head judge is aware of that information as soon as possible. However, the next couple of slides will talk about individuals who may be in the polling place without pre-authorization as long as the head judge has credentialed them. For example, members of the media are allowed to be in the polling place throughout election day as long as they present to the head judge credentials identifying them as a member of the media. If there is any question about whether or not an individual is a member of the media, the head judge should direct those questions to the county's elections office so that we can help troubleshoot and resolve the situation. Once a member of the media has been credentialed in, they are allowed to observe the voting process. They must maintain a 6-foot buffer from voters and refrain from interfering or conversing with voters while they're in the voting room. Members of the media may take audio, video, or photos, and they may do that with your permission as an election judge of you, and they may also do that of voters if the voter is also permissive of that activity. Whenever a member of the media is trying to record voters or voter activities, they must do so without disclosing private information or creating lists of who voted. Exit poll interviewers are also allowed to be near your polling location. They are oftentimes found at the exit door, and they may be on that property with the purpose of collecting information from voters who are voluntarily providing that information. Exit poll interviews are always optional, and the voter has discretion to participate or not participate. It is important that we always credential in anybody who is presenting themselves as an exit poll interviewer. They must provide the head judge with information, including an identification card, in order to serve in that capacity and remain in your polling place. Next, we are going to talk about the class of individuals who may be in the polling place, again with credentials. These folks are called challengers, and challengers have a very specific role in the state of Minnesota to personally challenge a voter's individual right to vote based on personal knowledge of that challenger that that voter is not eligible to vote. That is a very high bar and a very limited role for challengers in the polling place. However, before we get too far into the role of the challenger, we must remind everyone that challengers must be credentialed in by the head judge. Challengers will be appointed by one of the 2 major political parties in the state or by a candidate on the ballot. That credentialing process is formal, and your head judge will have additional information on that. As an election judge, if somebody is in the polling place and they are not there to vote, your obligation is to inform the head judge, and the head judge will investigate whether or not they are allowed to be there as an authorized individual. Once a challenger has been credentialed in, they are allowed to remain in the polling place in order to challenge that individual voter's right to vote. If a challenge actually does occur in the polling place, the head judge will become involved, as that challenger will document that challenge on a formal oath of challenge form and will never speak to the voter. The election judge always interacts with the voter in cases of challenges. It is also important to note that challengers are not allowed to make lists of who is voting. They are also not allowed to be on their phones or computers in the voting room, and they are also not allowed to handle election materials. Challengers are limited to one of each of the two major political parties at any given time, as well as one per candidate if appointed by that candidate and credentialed in. Challengers do not need to remain in your polling place at all times. They can come and go as long as they're communicating with the head judge and as long as that entrance and exit is not disruptive to your voting processes. One final note on challengers: it is always up to the voter to clear a challenge. If a voter refuses to participate in a challenge, they are not entitled to vote in that election on that election day. However, if they do work through the challenge and they certify that they are eligible to vote, they are entitled to cast a ballot. On election day, you may be providing assistance to voters in the polling place. Voters can get assistance from any person of their choosing, as long as that individual is not an agent of an employer for that voter, nor is that individual an agent of a union for that voter. If an individual presents themselves in the polling place and says that someone is there to provide assistance to them in the voting process, as an election judge, you ask the voter whether or not that person is an employer of that voter or a representative of a union for that voter. We don't need to collect names. We don't need to know why somebody's providing assistance. And we do not need to know what level of assistance they are providing. We simply need to be sure as election judges that that person providing assistance is not an employer or a union representative. People providing assistance in the polling place can do that for an unlimited number of voters. However, each voter must be asking for that assistance. People providing assistance cannot loiter in your polling place or near your polling place in a hope to provide assistance. They should always be coming in and out directly with the voter that they are providing assistance to at that time. That level of assistance can be at any point in the process, and it can look in many different ways for different voters. The thing to remember as an election judge is that assistance needs to be asked for by the voter. It should never be proactively or assumed necessary for voters. We'll also remind you that election judges can provide assistance in the polling place, again, only as much as requested. Never should an election judge make an assumption about somebody who needs assistance. One final reminder that it is important for election judges to maintain party balance if they are actually marking a ballot on behalf of a voter based on that voter's request and instruction. Never should an individual judge be providing that level of assistance to a voter. There are additional resources available to make sure that our polling places are accessible to all of our voters. Every voter is entitled to vote with as much independence as they request, and that may involve them using the express vote, having election judges provide assistance, or having someone of their own choosing provide assistance. Also remember that we do have tools available such as the language line that your head judge can help a voter utilize in order to provide translation services on election day. The county also provides age awareness training for election judges in the form of a video that lives on our election judge training website, available at blueearthcountymn.gov/elections. If you are providing assistance to a voter on election day, it is critical as an election judge to respect that voter's right to privacy and never reveal their vote. It is also important for election judges to not assume that a voter's right to vote has been challenged or removed based on perceived cognitive or other disabilities or abilities. We are now going to focus on a series of specific election day tasks that are completed in Blue Earth County so that you get a better understanding of how they operate in our county's polling places. Please note that many of these tasks are completed across the state, but each county may operate slightly differently in these capacities. We are going to start out by talking about curbside voting. Curbside voting is available to any voter who wishes to utilize it for any reason. As election judges, we cannot ask why, and we cannot refuse or restrict somebody from accessing curbside voting opportunities based on perceived needs or lack of needs or busyness in your polling place. When we provide curbside voting, we need to ensure that we have 2 election judges of different political parties. This is one of the tasks that requires a bipartisan pair or team of judges. Essentially, the curbside voting process will result in bringing the election day activities from your polling places to the curbside, to that voter's car. We provide all of our polling places with a curbside voting kit, which will have all the instructions necessary, as well as many of the supplies and tools that you will need. Ultimately, the curbside voting process requires you to identify the voter and get them checked in or registered so that we can verify their eligibility to vote. Once that occurs, the voter is going to complete the voting process on a ballot at their car, and then that ballot is going to be returned to the polling place and tabulated in your counter, just like any other vote cast on election day. It is critical for our election judges participating in this process to remind the voter that they must stay in their car at the curbside until you have assured them that their ballot has been counted by the tabulator. If for some reason the ballot cannot be accepted by the tabulator and that voter has already left the curbside voting experience, that ballot cannot be counted and it is an abandoned ballot. So again, it is important for that voter to stay in their car at the curbside until you have given them the all clear that their ballot has been accepted. We're also going to spend a few minutes here talking about how we check in voters on our poll pads on election day. Again, if you are able to attend the open house during the week of July 20th, that is an opportunity for you to practice these exercises. However, that is optional, and most of our judges find that it is very easy to check in voters once they've had as few as 1 or 2 check-ins under the advice and suggestion of other election judges or their head judge. When we are checking in voters on our poll pads, it is important for our election judges to be sure that the voter is the person providing the information and not the other way around. Never should an election judge state what a voter's name, address, or date of birth is and ask the voter to confirm that. Instead, it is always the voter who is stating their name and their address, as well as their date of birth if necessary to verify or confirm their record. When we do search for a voter on the poll pad, we are going to search with as few characters as possible to speed up the process and eliminate the potential that you mistype something on the screen. Searching with as few as 3 characters of the voter's last name is adequate to return a sample of voters so that you can select the right record based on the first name and address. However, always confirm the voter's full name and full address. If the information does not match exactly, and it is not a clear clerical error in the record, that voter will need to re-register. However, if you do search for a voter who is checking in and you find an exact match on your poll pad for that voter's registration record, you can select that record, review it on a larger screen, and hit the accept button. Once you hit the accept button, we turn the poll pad screen over to the voter so that they can also review the information and read the oath that they will be signing. The voter will sign on the screen after they are comfortable that they meet the eligibility requirements for the election and can sign to that oath. After the voter has signed on the screen of the poll pad screen is returned to the election judge so that the election judge can verify that on the screen that the signature has been captured, and then the election judge will hit submit. Once the submit button is selected, a receipt for the voter's signature attesting to their oath will print out. That is the election judge's record that they have checked in that voter and that voter has stated that they meet eligibility requirements. That is your proof that you have checked in a voter and will be part of the reconciliation process as we close the polls. Additionally, a voter receipt will print out of the poll pad. This receipt will indicate that that voter is eligible to receive a ballot from our ballot judges. The receipt indicates the precinct and the school district that the voter resides in to ensure that that voter is getting the right ballot. For nearly all of our precincts in Blue Earth County, there's only 1 ballot available. However, we do have some precincts outside of the city of Mankato that need to verify the school district when issuing a ballot. Some additional reminders for our poll pad judges are that the poll pads are the same ones that we were using in the 2024 election, so most of the functionality stays the same. However, there is a new application version that has changed some of the functionality, but it is very limited enhancement and you will be very comfortable utilizing the devices just like you did in 2024. For our new judges, you'll experience those changes through the open house that we hope that you attended. We'll also remind all of our election judges that the date of birth selection when registering a voter on the poll pad is still clunky at best. It requires you to start with entering the year of birth, starting with the month, then you're going to select the year, and then let's start that over. As I said, this is clunky in the processing, and so as you can see, I'm struggling with that. We select the date of birth field, that opens up the calendar, and then you're going to select on the month and year part to select the year for that voter. Once you've selected the year, then you can roll to the month, and then you will actually tap on the birth date of that voter to finalize that selection. As you heard me say, it is a clunky process. It does not necessarily flow intuitively, and that is unfortunately something we cannot change. However, as you get more comfortable with registering voters, you will understand the process is to select year first, then month, and then date to select the voter's date of birth. There are several other tips and tricks that are of value when we're using the poll pads to check in or register voters. As you become more experienced with them, you will understand these tips and tricks and how they work, but rely on your head judges and your fellow judges with experience with the poll pads to help you learn how to do all of these things. The one item that I will point out on this screen that is of assistance is that driver's licenses that are issued in Minnesota, as well as Minnesota identification cards, can be scanned to help with the check-in and registration processes. As we noted in the earlier video, however, driver's licenses or IDs are not required to vote, and we must state that to voters, even though we can still use them to help us through the registration or check-in processes. When we issue ballots in Blue Earth County, we want to make sure that we are following a very specific protocol to help us assure full security and accountability for all of our ballots. As we already discussed, when ballot judges are opening new packs of ballots, they are going to account for all ballots in that pack and document any discrepancies. Once those packs of ballots are opened, and once they are initialed by 2 election judges of any political party or even unaffiliated judges, we need to ensure that we can account for each one of those ballots that are being issued to voters. We account for those ballots by maintaining the voter receipt. Remember that the voter receipt is only issued to a voter once they have signed the oath stating their eligibility to vote in the election. That is your proof that you should be issuing them a ballot, and it is also your proof that you have issued a ballot in the election. As we talk about closing the polls and reconciling our results and our returns on election night, you will be counting all of your voter receipts to tie out to the number of ballots that you have issued on election day so that we can account for all of the ballots that were assigned to your polling place on election day. When we also issue ballots, we are going to make sure that we offer it in a secrecy folder to voters. However, voters can decline that secrecy folder and only take their ballot if that's their choice. Once the voter has cast their ballot, meaning that they filled in their ovals, they are going to insert it into the tabulator to be counted. The tabulator judge has an important responsibility to ensure that only ballots issued in that precinct on election day are tabulated. As we've mentioned earlier, the tabulator will only count ballots for your assigned precinct. However, voters may have requested a ballot in the mail, and while we do not expect them to bring them into the polling place, we need to be very watchful that the ballots being fed into the tabulator are ballots being issued in your precinct on election day. This requires the ballot tabulator judge to stay near the equipment, however, outside of the 6-foot buffer that ensures privacy to the voter as they insert their ballot. The ballot tabulator judge is going to help the voter understand that they insert the ballot under the black plastic part of the tabulator and that they give it an extra little push to make sure that the rollers on the tabulator scanner grab the ballot. Then the voter must wait until they see on the screen that their ballot has been accepted with a thank you prompt or an error message appears. If the error message appears, the ballot tabulator judge can help the voter troubleshoot that. However, the voter can read the instructions themselves and make their own decisions if they're able and comfortable. Most of the time, if an error pops up on the screen, it will result in the voter receiving a spoiled ballot, in which you will instruct the voter to take their ballot back to the ballot judge and inform the ballot judge that they need a replacement ballot. In that instance, the ballot judge will work through the spoiled ballot process, documenting that exchange and giving that voter a new, identical but blank ballot so that they can re-vote and then reinsert it into the tabulator. The next section of our training is going to focus on Election Day registration. In Minnesota, there are numerous ways to register on Election Day, and as an election judge, we do not need you to become an expert in all of those opportunities or avenues for registration. What we do need all of our election judges to know are the general requirements to register in the state of Minnesota, as well as the various opportunities to register, and then to know the resources that are available to help you complete the registration process. There are numerous resources, especially the poll pad, which will walk you step by step through the registration process and prompt you to collect the appropriate and legal information to be part of a voter registration application. But you also have the ability to talk to experienced judges and your head judge, as well as the county in any situation that is unusual or that you're not comfortable addressing. Remember that Election Day registration is available to any eligible voter, and it is up to you to make sure that process is completed appropriately. Never let a voter attempt to persuade you to allow them to register under old information, under their old last name, under a different apartment number in the same building. All of those instances are cases where the voter must re-register. That re-registration is for the protection of our system and the integrity of our rosters, but it is also to protect you in complying with Election Day laws. However, most importantly, it is there as a protection of the voter, as any Election Day registration is followed up after the election to be verified for its accuracy. If a voter tries to register under information that is not current and cannot be verified, that will require additional investigation, including potential prosecution with law enforcement officials. We will remind as we start the Election Day registration section that while there are many ways to provide proof of residence and proof of identity for purposes of Election Day registration, showing a current driver's license with current name and address is often the most common and oftentimes the most efficient way to register. However, we need to make sure that voters understand that that is not the requirement and not their only way to register. Please be prepared with the language that you'll be using to help a voter understand this. Oftentimes, the best statement to say is that there are many ways to register in the state of Minnesota, and to provide the voter with the checklist or the items that are acceptable proofs of identity and residency. You can also instruct a voter that a driver's license or ID often helps with the process, but it is not required. Either way, we want to make sure that we can provide the level of customer service necessary so that voters recognize that they can register in Minnesota utilizing various proofs of residency and identity. As we get into the logistics of registration, in Blue Earth County, we consider this a 3-check process followed by an application. When we check voters for purposes of Election Day registration, we start with verifying their eligibility to vote. In Minnesota, for Election Day registration purposes, voters state that they're an eligible voter and sign an oath to that affirmation. Voters will then also prove their place in the precinct, their residency in the precinct with official documentation on an approved list, and then they will also verify their face or their identity with additional documentation that is on an approved list. It is only after they are willing to sign an oath to their eligibility, only after they are able to prove their place or residency in the precinct, and only after they are able to verify their face or their identity do we start the application process for that voter. More information regarding the eligibility of the voter in order to register for Election Day purposes is on this slide. Voters again attest to this information. They sign an oath affirming to this in each and every registration. First off, they have to be a U.S. citizen. They have to be 18 years of age on Election Day, and they need to be a resident of the state of Minnesota for at least 20 days. Please note this is residency in the state, not necessarily in your specific precinct. Voters also lose eligibility if they are currently incarcerated for a felony conviction, or if they are under a court order that revokes their right to vote, or if they've been ruled legally incompetent. Those last two features there are very uncommon, and they will almost always be pre-loaded onto your poll pads for voters. However, it is still up to the voter to sign the oath after reading it, which would include all of these eligibility requirements. Once a voter is comfortable with the eligibility requirements to vote in the state of Minnesota, then they must prove their place or residency in your precinct. We need to ensure the voter is in the right location based on our precinct finder or other tools available to you, such as maps or the poll pad. If the voter is in the right location based on the address that they consider their residence, then we are going to ask for their way of proving that. Again, as mentioned, quite frequently, their proof of place, their proof of residency is going to be a current and valid Minnesota driver's license, permit, or ID card. Temporary credentials or the receipt that includes their photo also works for this purpose. We'll also share that many times if voters are using a current driver's license, this will also prove their identity in the next check. If a voter does not have a current or valid Minnesota driver's license, permit, or ID card that does not have their current name and their current address on it, then they can use other proofs of place. Other proofs of place include tribal identification cards with the current address and signature and picture, or it also could be a solid waste or utility bill, a lease agreement, a phone, a TV statement, mortgage banking information, credit card information, or student fee statements. There is a long list of ways for voters to prove their place of residence in your precinct. However, they must provide something that is on the list that is preloaded in your poll pad or on the sheets that are made available to voters as part of the registration process. Items not on the list are not acceptable. If a voter does have an acceptable form of proof of place, they need to present that to you for your record-keeping purposes. You will not keep that document, but you will make note in your registration process that that is what you viewed. When you are viewing that document, you need to pay attention to whether or not it is actually a physical version of that or a digital option. The digital option is acceptable provided it is a replica of the paper or physical version of that documentation. All documentation must also be current within 30 days before or after the election. We will also note that it is incredibly important that as you're reviewing the place documentation, that you check the name of the individual listed as associated with that address proving place. The name on this place document must specifically match the name of the voter who is registering that you're going to verify in the next section of our checking process. Once we have verified that the voter can prove their place in your precinct, that their residence is in your precinct, then we need to match the name on that place proving document with some other form of photo identification that will prove or verify the identity of the voter. Again, the name must match. Oftentimes, the identity is proven by a current driver's license or permit card or ID card. However, that for purposes of identifying the individual, that card does not need to be issued by the state of Minnesota, and it also does not need to be current. The only reason it would need to be current and be from the state of Minnesota is if they're trying to use that same document to prove their place. Again, in order to prove identity or verify identity, the voter can use other options. The other options are listed on the screen, such as a U.S. issued passport, military ID or veterans ID. A tribal ID as well can prove identity. University or college IDs issued in the state of Minnesota with photos can work as identity proving documentation, as can a Minnesota issued high school ID, provided again it has a photo. The most important thing to remember in this step is that that name identifying the voter on this proof of identity or verification of identity must match the name of the individual on the place proving documentation. Only after we have worked through those first three steps do we start to register the voter on the poll pad. It is critical to make sure that we understand the path of registration before we start the registration process to not frustrate voters needlessly. We want to make sure that the voter is in the right location and is able to complete the registration process before we start it so that we can be more efficient with all of our voters, including the voter who is trying to register. When you are completing the registration process on the poll pad, be very careful to follow all of the on-screen prompts. The poll pad will not allow you to register a voter without completing all of the necessary fields, as well as verifying the necessary information such as date of birth and documenting your proofs of place and your proofs of identity. Once the registration process is complete, the election judge will review that on the screen and initial it as their work. That voter will then be registered. The registration application will print out, and you will check in that voter. Once that voter is checked in with their new information, the receipts for the voter that we've already discussed, their voter's oath, as well as their voter's receipt will print out. If a voter is not able to register under that traditional methodology of proving place and face, they will then work through other options to register. The most common of these other options to register will be the vouching option. This one should be used only if the voter cannot prove their face and place under the traditional or the primary method of registration. In order for an individual to be vouched for, they must have somebody who is already registered in that precinct that personally knows that that new registrant maintains a residence in the precinct. That voucher, the person who is going to make that statement, will actually sign an oath attesting to that new registrant's residence in the precinct. Oftentimes, this vouching scenario is the option for voters to register if they are newly married and do not have documentation that shows their new name, or if they are very new to the precinct and they do not yet have utility bills, banking statements, or a driver's license or ID card with that new address on it. But again, it is important for the voter who is looking for a voucher to bring in a voucher who personally knows that individual is a resident of that precinct. In this vouching scenario, that person providing the vouching can only do that for up to 8 new registrants. It is also important to note that somebody who is vouching cannot have been vouched for on election day themselves. An individual who is vouching must either be pre-registered or register under the more traditional face and place proving registration process. The vouching process is completed on the poll pad. There are additional steps involving the actual voucher and identifying the voucher. And there is also an additional form called the Precinct List of Person Vouching, where we will provide additional information about the voucher in order to maintain the appropriate record keeping for the election. Your head judge will have more information about this precinct list of person vouching. There is another version of vouching that is available only to specific residential facilities. Residential facilities include nursing homes, assisted living facilities, veterans homes, supervised living facilities, homeless shelters, and others, including domestic abuse shelters. This form of vouching only applies to those types of facilities, and it only applies to employees who work at those facilities. In this instance, an employee who works at one of those qualifying facilities can vouch for an unlimited number of voters who reside at the facility. Where you will oftentimes see this is at assisted living facilities or nursing homes, where an activities director or other employee will bring a van full or several voters from that facility to your precinct on election day to vote. Oftentimes those voters do not have anything that proves their residence in the precinct, as oftentimes those facilities have comprehensive bills that do not actually list the specific room that the individual may be residing in or the assisted living apartment. Again, in those instances, the employee can vouch for an unlimited number of people, but only at the facility at which they work. In this instance, that employee must validate or authenticate themselves with the head judge by providing an employee ID card or have other documentation that your head judge will know how to collect and evaluate. If a newly registering voter cannot do that under the traditional face and place proving documentation, and if they also cannot find somebody who can vouch for them and say that they personally know that they reside in the facility or in that precinct, then that person still has other options in order to register to vote on election day. In these instances, which are very rare, we would encourage you to bring your head judge into the conversation so that we can ensure the full level of service to that voter and help any eligible voter who is entitled to vote in your precinct complete that process. There are, again, multiple ways for folks to register, and we don't need you to be an expert on all of them. We just need you to be aware that they exist and involve your head judge as necessary. I will note that the option for college students to use a photo ID with a university-provided college list is becoming more and more common. So you may be assigned to a precinct where this list is more readily utilized by all election judges. If you find yourself in a precinct with the university or college list being utilized on a more frequent basis, your head judge will provide you with additional training. Additionally, essentially, the college list provides another way for a student who is enrolled at that university or institution to prove their place in your precinct. However, they still have to provide a face proving document such as a Minnesota issued student ID or some other sort of photo ID or driver's license or US passport, for example. If you are working with the student list, it is important to remember that the student list is only as complete and accurate as the information that student provides to the registrar at their institution or university. If the information is not correct and we do not have that student's local address provided on that student list, they must register under one of the other options to register in the state of Minnesota. This slide provides a recap of the registration process. Remember, we first off always make sure the voter is in the right location, and then we make sure that the voter understands the eligibility requirements that they will be attesting to as part of the registration process. Once we have met those two criteria, then we determine the best path to register the voter by asking questions on how they will prove their place in your precinct and how we will verify their their identity matches the proof of place. It's after those steps are done that we will actually complete the registration application process on the poll pad by following the prompts on the screen to ensure that we have collected all required information and that the voter meets all eligibility requirements in order to vote in the election. If you are not able to register a voter, that gets documented on a form that your head judge will have available. And then we also want to make sure that we document any incidences or issues related to the registration process on your incident log. I mentioned that there are numerous ways to register, and we do not need you to be an expert on all of those ways. We need you to be an expert on finding the resources and answers necessary to help voters, and then following the steps on the poll pad to complete the registration process. Do know that your election judge guide has more information on the registration processes and steps. Your head judge has additional information, and other experienced judges will have experience registering voters. Our poll pad kits also include tips and trick sheets, and there is additional information available through your training slide deck that you received at your in-person election judge training. Our next section, and our last section in this middle part of election day activities, is about conduct in the polling place. When we talk about conduct in the polling place, we are primarily going to focus on campaigning. Campaigning is not allowed during the voting hours in your polling location, as well as within a 100-foot buffer of your polling place. Campaigning is also not allowed on any public property associated with your polling place, provided it is within that 100-foot buffer, or if you are on a public property that is larger than 100 foot, it will extend to that 100 foot. We cannot restrict, and we do not have control over private actions on private property, regardless of where it is located in proximity to your polling place. What we mean by this is if somebody is campaigning on private property, it is not something that the election judge can prohibit or try to remove. If individuals have concerns about campaigning on private property, that is a private property matter that will need to be directed to the owner of that property. And if it is the owner of that property who has concerns with campaigning on their property, they will need to notify law enforcement for any potential follow-up. When we talk about campaigning, we need to be very careful what we are monitoring. Campaigning and the prohibition on campaigning in the polling place applies to any sorts of materials, but it also applies to speech. Campaign materials and speech include anything related to the candidate, the political party, or a ballot question. But these items only apply to the parties, the candidates, and the questions on the ballots in your precinct for that election. So let's talk more about this. When we talk about campaign materials and speech, especially as it relates to candidates, we're talking to names of candidates, likenesses or nicknames of candidates, as well as pictures or other identifying information about the candidate, such as their logos or slogans. If a voter or an individual is trying to campaign for an individual candidate by stating their name or handing out materials related to the candidate in your polling place, or on public property within 100 feet of your polling place, or on the entirety of the polling place if it is public property and larger than 100 feet, you're going to consider that campaigning, and we will need to follow our processes to address that, which we will talk about on the next slide. Similarly, if an individual is campaigning for a political party, either by name of that party, by logo, or by slogan of any party represented by a candidate on your ballot for that election, we need to consider that campaigning. Finally, the same prohibition on campaigning follows through to any ballot questions, including any number or title or specific subject matters, slogans, or logos associated with that ballot question. In any of those instances, it applies to the ballot in front of you on election day. And in all of those instances, it applies to your polling place, or again, that 100-foot buffer around your polling place, provided it is public property. When you identify campaigning in the polling place, it is the election judge's obligation to address that circumstance. In order to address the circumstance, the election judge is going to ask the individual to cover up or remove or refrain from campaigning in the polling place. That oftentimes involves removing hats, removing buttons, retiring to a bathroom to turn a shirt inside out, or to just put materials that they brought into the polling place that they're trying to distribute away and out of sight. The election judge's obligation is to ask the voter to do this. If the voter fails to comply or refuses to comply, the election judge will immediately involve their head judge. The head judge will repeat the request to comply with state law to not campaign in the polling place or near the polling place. If refusal continues, the head judge is going to document the refusal, including the name, address, and material, if available, on the incident log. The head judge will also inform the individual that they are going to be turned over for potential investigation and potential charging as they are violating state election law. It is important to remember that an individual, regardless if they are campaigning in the polling place, regardless if they refuse to comply with your instructions regarding campaigning in the polling place, is still entitled to vote. We strongly encourage election judges and head judges to use discretion to work through this process as quickly as possible, as we oftentimes find that an individual who is choosing to fail to comply with state law in this regard is trying to make a bigger scene and have a stage in your polling place. Helping them vote as quickly as possible removes that stage and will limit the disruption in your polling place. It is also important to note that while campaigning will occur in your polling place, it is almost always an honest mistake of the voter that they do not understand the prohibition against campaigning. A simple prompt, a professional request to have an individual remove a hat or to stop talking about candidates or stop handing out materials in the polling place will oftentimes address it very quickly and without any incident. As we've already mentioned, campaigning is not allowed in the polling place. We also should remind election judges that individuals cannot linger in the polling place or within 100 feet of the polling place. There are other requirements against certain activities in the polling place, and we want to make sure that election judges pay attention to all activities of individuals in their polling place so that they can address them as soon as possible. One thing that is not prohibited in the polling place is the use of phones. We strongly encourage voters to not be on their phones in the polling place, however, we cannot strictly prohibit it. Phones may be used for purposes of providing assistance to voters, and voters will oftentimes have their phones as that is just a normal course of everyday life. However, as election judges, you need to ensure that voters are not recording or making lists of other voters, and that the use of the phone is not interfering or obstructing with the voting process. While a phone might be in somebody's hand while they're in the polling place, if they are trying to use it to record other voters or what you're doing as an election judge, that is potentially in violation of recording or making lists of voters. Also, if somebody is on their phone to such an extent that it is slowing down your processes, or utilizing or occupying a voting booth longer than would seem reasonably necessary, then an election judge can approach the use of phone from that obstruction concept and ask a voter to refrain from its use or to try to be more efficient in their use of the voting location. If there are any current concerns or questions about phone use in the polling place, your head judge would be a great resource, and the county will also provide additional information if the need arises. Since we are talking about phones, we'll also remind the election judges in Blue Earth County that we do not allow you as an election judge to have your phone out and within visual sight of voters while you're working in a polling place on election day. Phones can be on your possession, and if you do need to, as in your pocket, and if you do need to make a phone call, we would ask you to inform your head judge and then recuse yourself to outside of the actual voting room to complete that call. Minnesota does have a series of prohibitions and activity in the polling place, and so we provide this slide as a summary for you. As a reminder, we do not have poll watchers or poll observers unless they are specifically appointed by the county or by the state. Anybody in the polling place who is not there to vote must be immediately addressed, and your head judge will work with them to see if they're an authorized individual. Folks may not linger or stay in the polling place to observe. They cannot threaten, compel, intimidate, obstruct, or bribe voters. There are laws prohibiting them tearing down, defacing, or damaging supplies or equipment. And they also are not allowed to remove files or supplies from the polling place unless authorized by law. The only authorization in law would be the head judge removing items at the close of polls to return them to the county. Again, campaigning is not allowed in the polling place, as well as disorderly conduct. Voters who are obviously intoxicated are not allowed in the polling place, and smoking is also strictly prohibited. On election day, voters may be unhappy with the service they receive, or they may allege that you are violating a state or federal law. In those instances, there are documentation available for voters to use to register those complaints or to allege those violations of law. In Blue Earth County, we utilize a feedback form. The feedback form is used as a customer service tool to allow a voter who is unhappy with any sort of service on election day to share that concern with the county. The county acts on those concerns and will react and respond as appropriate to improve our election services or address specific circumstances. We encourage election judges to use these forms as an opportunity to help de-escalate situations and to allow voters to know that their concerns and their voice will be heard. These forms can also be used to provide kudos if an election judge wishes to give you credit for good service on election day. These forms are available from your head judge, and as mentioned, the county will review all of them as they are returned as part of the election night results and return. If a voter is alleging that there is a violation of a state or federal law, the voter has every right to complete a form stating that violation. These forms are formal and of violations of law, and they must be notarized. The voter will oftentimes need to take these forms from the polling place to complete the process. They can bring these forms back to the polling place. They can return them to the county election office, or if they prefer, they can turn them in directly to law enforcement officials. Election judges would not get involved in these forms. If somebody is alleging a violation of law, they should be turned over to the head judge for immediate attention. With this slide, we have concluded the middle section of our training recap. This section was focused on election day activities. Again, if you wish to watch additional videos, you can look for the first video, which prepares our election judges to serve, as well as prepares our polling place for election day voting. Or you can watch our third video, which will talk about closing the polls, as well as the security of our polling place. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your service as an election judge.